Thank you, Megan. In part 2 of our story on the state of the NMI Retirement Fund, we take a look at criticisms leveled against the government for actions and inactions that have severely undermined the pension program. In 2000, the fund had over $400 million in its corpus. Today, assets stand at less than $250 million and are projected to run to zero in a little over a year. In a presentation to federal judge Francis Tydingco-Gatewood this week, attorney Joyce Tang of the fund's trustee ad litem, the law firm Seville & Tang, said it's clear that the CNMI government intends to abandon the fund and doesn't really care about the beneficiaries. Tang took aim at the government's contention that it is making piecemeal efforts to stabilize the fund. As examples of these efforts, Assistant Attorney General Reena Patel cited Public Law 1782, which allows non-retired members to withdraw their contributions without penalty, as well as plans to float a pension obligation bond. But Tang said 1782 will accelerate depletion of the fund to zero by March 2014. She also said that contrary to the government's claims, eliminating active employees from the picture will make little difference for the fund's total unfunded liability of $1.5 billion, in part because 78% of that liability is due to current retirees. Fund actuary Dylan Porter explains.
Instead of $1.5 billion, maybe it reduces to $1.2 billion, but instead of $200 million to pay it, it reduces to $87 million, so you still have a huge problem.
Tang also attacked the government's plans to float a pension obligation bond, which she called ridiculous and not realistic given the CNMI's poor credit rating. The fund's investment consultant Maggie Rabowski agreed and noted that the CNMI is currently paying down a relatively small bond that is already junk rated. A $300 million bond for the fund was unlikely, she said, and if the CNMI could afford the interest payment, estimated at $36 million per year, it might as well pay that amount directly into the fund. According to Tang, the court can either appoint a receiver for the fund to implement a restructuring plan if the government is willing to commit assets, or it can appoint a receiver to implement a liquidation plan. But she said liquidation won't be a complete solution because the unfunded liability of the fund will become the liability of the CNMI. Allowing liquidation would amount to letting the CNMI off the hook, and she urged the court not to permit the government to shirk its responsibilities. And after the fund's presentation, the court called on Finance Secretary Larissa Larsen to testify on the government's efforts to meet its obligations to the fund. Larsen maintained that the government has never wavered in its commitment to retirees. It's not that the CNMI doesn't want to pay the fund, she said, but that the government has no cash reserves and spends taxes as they come in, sometimes on issues of literal life or death. The Finance Secretary also said the government has plans to stretch the life of the fund through various measures, including diverting lapsed monies from closed projects and making smaller but more frequent payments. When attorney Bruce Jorgensen, who represents plaintiff retiree Betty Johnson in this litigation, asked if the government has any policies or procedures in place to satisfy the fund's outstanding judgment against the government, Larsen admitted there was, quote, nothing specific. The government currently owes the fund more than $300 million in unpaid employer contributions and is yet to pay a dime. Jorgensen's co-counsel Marjorie Bronster told the court the fund is on the brink of oblivion and retirees face unimaginable hardship. The government's good intentions and faint hopes for a solution, she said, are simply not enough.
They're making choices about what they're paying and what they aren't. But I think what's really important to recognize here is there is a contractual obligation to the retirees. And what the government is choosing to do is simply not fund the retirement fund. And that's not legal. They cannot simply ignore the law and ignore the constitutional rights of the beneficiaries and say, we've chosen to spend the money elsewhere.
Since that hearing, all of the parties, including the government, have agreed to participate in settlement talks. Honolulu Judge Robert Ferris is designated settlement judge and is expected to call a conference next week.